Resident Evil is always having an identity crisis. What type of game is it really? Is it a fast-paced action game? Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6 say yes. Is it a puzzle-based survival horror game? Resident Evil 1, 2, 3 and 7 say yes. The series is constantly zigzagging between ideas, between camera styles, inventory styles, and Capcom have never been afraid to really experiment with the idea of what Resident Evil really is. So, after the return to puzzle-based survival horror with Resident Evil 7 and the introduction of a first-person perspective and Ethan Winters, we were asked again, what is Resident Evil? While playing through Resident Evil 8, I was constantly asking myself that question. What is Resident Evil? And I wasn't saying it because the series had turned into an uncontrollable amalgamation covered in a bin bag that would eventually destroy half of Raccoon City, but because I was genuinely pleasantly surprised with the direction that the series had gone in. If I were to compare this Resident Evil to any of the others, I'd say its parents are Resident Evil 4 and 7. So, if you haven't played either of these, it's an action focused but still has heavy exploration, secrets, treasures and puzzles. The combination of two playstyles does leave a little to be desired. Sure, there's a focus on inventory management with the return of the attaché case, but never did I feel like I was over encumbered with items, nor that I really needed to sort my inventory out other than to make it pleasing to my eye. Puzzles are plentiful for sure, but they really vary in terms of quality. You have a couple of small riddle-like puzzles, but then some are so laughably easy, there was really no real reason that the puzzle should have existed in the first place. A great example of this is the piano puzzle. At first, you're just presented with a music sheet, and thoughts start to run through your head, unless you're a musician. Thoughts such as, I don't know how to read sheet music, how are Capcom expecting me to solve this? But as you tap on the notes, the game tells you where it's placed on the scale, and once you get the correct note, the game moves you on to the next one. There's no punishment for guessing incorrectly, and really there's no puzzle there. It's just keep pressing the keys until you unlock an item. Now, I know why this decision was made, because say if they made the puzzle force you to learn sheet music and play each note in sequence, a lot of players would either be at an impasse for a long time, would look up a guide, or would just stop playing. So the decision to simplify the potential of this puzzle was made to not alienate players, and I feel like there's a few of these decisions throughout the game where, because there's a divide in the fan base between classic and modern RE games, that Capcom doesn't want to completely commit to one. So some quality ideas get diluted for a wider appeal. That's not to say there aren't some real diamonds in this game, but I feel Capcom never really trusts you to find a solution for yourself. I played this version of the game on a vanilla PS4, a PS4 Amera, and I'm surprised at how great the game looked. Sure, when you walk around and start swinging your knife at objects, most don't react, but small visual details and animation quirks really stand out. For example, Capcom included a different animation if you reload with bullets still in your magazine, and your gun will visually look different when it's out of ammo. The game looks stunning. Capcom really squeezed as much juice as they could from the dusty old generation consoles, and while I was playing, I barely ever felt any frame drops. The most noticeable frame drop I experienced was viewing one of the character models which had a lot of moving parts. Although my PS4 sounded like it was about to take off, you could probably cook an egg or two with the heat it was giving off, and that was just at the title screen. The introductory stages of the game were pretty slow. It was the same case in Resident Evil 7, but with this game on my first playthrough it felt like the introduction was roughly around an hour. And then when you get access to your equipment, you are thrown into the deep end with a sequence very reminiscent of the Resident Evil 4 village fight sequence, except this time you probably won't have enough ammo to deal with every enemy. I started the game on hardcore mode, so this bit seemed a bit unbalanced compared to the rest of the game, and I've seen countless others stuck on this part for at least an hour or two. This was the only real spike in difficulty I experienced throughout, and felt the rest of the game was fairly balanced. Although for replayability purposes, the middle section of the game with the second and third lords have sections that can only really be played out in a single way, really removing player freedom and surprise and repeated playthroughs. This is also the issue with some of the puzzles in game, and Resident Evil Remake 2 also had this problem where puzzle solutions were the same. So if you had a strong memory, you could solve a couple of the puzzles without the busy work required and get some items earlier. On the topic of replayability, there was a whole host of unlockable items including new weapons, concept art, character models, an extra harder difficulty, and extra challenges like the mercenaries, which offer a change of pace and changes how you play the game. Quite substantial unlocks, and I really adore this trend from Capcom to include all of the concept art and models so you can really inspect the finer details and the work they put into the monsters, environments, and planning the game. Throughout its years, Resident Evil has taken many different forms, from isometric survival horror to third-person survival horror to third-person action game, and now first-person action and survival horror. And fans have had mixed reception throughout the series' history. If you looked at this footage without having foreknowledge, would you really think you were playing a Resident Evil game? I remember seeing the original trailer for Resident Evil 7 and being confused and concerned for the franchise, until I actually played the game and all of my fears about the game disappeared and emerged as a tense reimagining of the original Resident Evil game. Only in first person, and where that game seemed to be inspired by horror franchises like Saw, Evil Dead, and the Blair Witch Project, with some Louisiana swamp inspired monsters. Whereas Resident Evil 8 has some influence from Dark Souls and Bloodborne, and some monster designs are inspired by European monster mythology with designs styled on vampires, Dimitrescu and her daughters, werewolves, the lycans you meet in the game, and a couple other monsters that I won't spoil here, but I'll say it had me asking if I was really playing Resident Evil.
I'm the child. You're the one who's arguing with Miranda's decision.
You wouldn't know responsibility if it was welded
Oh,
to
keep growing. One day your head might actually fit your ego.
Hey, don't I get a say in this?
While I do think Resident Evil 8 is a great entry into the series, I do think on multiple run-throughs it does lose some of its luster. A few rough patches and instances where the developer holds the player's hand a bit too often. The environment and some of the enemy designs are top-notch and the game is fully optimized for PlayStation 4. It's great that they decided to experiment with the location and environments this time around, and overall it's a more successful attempt at trying to please Resident Evil fans and survival horror Resident Evil fans than the attempt that was made with Resident Evil 6. It's worth your time as a fan of the series, and there isn't a high barrier for entry for any new fans, as the game does a good job of leading the player towards the correct route. Overall, my experience of this game was far less enjoyable than my experience of Resident Evil 7. When replaying the game for a second or third time, the middle sections of the games don't hold the same sort of luster without the surprise elements that they do the first time around. These sections feel weak because unlike the rest of the game, there's only one way to get through them, so when you're playing it a second or third time it might feel like a slog because you're doing the exact same thing again and again. The Mercenaries, while a welcome addition to the game, doesn't really have much depth compared to previous incarnations of the game mode, especially those in Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6. One last thing to add on weapon balance: on the higher difficulties it doesn't feel very fun to shoot certain enemy types as enemies don't react accordingly, especially when compared to previous games in the series such as Resident Evil 4 and 5, which have great enemy reactions when you shoot them. In this game sometimes they just absorb bullets, especially on the harder difficulties, where I've shot an enemy with a shotgun and they've went through and armoured through the attack. Overall I think it's quite a strong game, but not as strong as the Resident Evil 2 remaster, and not as strong as the previous mainline entry in the series, Resident Evil 7. Overall, I'd give this game a 7 out of 10.